Hi, my name is Skylar Baylor, and in 2015, when I joined Harvard Men's Swim and Dive, I became the first transgender man to compete for a Division I men's team. Before that, I struggled intensely with an eating disorder, depression, self-harm, and other mental illnesses. My eating disorder was my number one struggle, and I actually began struggling about 3 years before I went to college in 2012. I had kind of always had an awareness of food, but it hadn't been problematic until I got to high school and I started thinking more about body image and just sort of my relationship with myself. I didn't have the maturity to really think about what any of that meant, and I had been a competitive athlete for my entire life, so I didn't take time to do more than what I was supposed to. I just ate the food that I was supposed to eat and competed. Halfway through my high school career, so the beginning of my junior year, I actually broke my back. This was in August of 2012, and breaking my back robbed the number one vice distraction from me, which was swimming. So for 20 extra hours a week, I wasn't doing what I usually did, which was swim, and in that emptiness, my mental health just plummeted. I began struggling initially with bulimia and anorexia, kind of tossing those back and forth. I was struggling a lot with how I felt out of control. I wasn't allowed to swim and I didn't know what to do with the extra energy, and so I fell really, really deeply into this eating disorder. I also had a lot of body image issues at the time, and I just wasn't seeing myself correctly, and I think now as I look back, it's really easy to see that I was using food to control something about my life because I didn't know how to control things at the time, and I didn't feel like I had a whole lot of control. But at the time, the sort of mental process I was going through was just a lot of distress with my body. For the next 2 years, I was in psychotherapy. I went to weekly sessions and I attended a group therapy for eating disorders, specifically for girls with eating disorders. And I didn't feel like any of it helped me. I kind of felt like I was banging my head against the wall and not getting anywhere. I really didn't feel like my therapist and I connected, but I was not in a space to look for a new one. It wasn't until the end of my senior year, so around the spring of my senior year, that I really was struggling, so much so that I'd gone to the hospital a couple times for the self-harm issues that I was experiencing. And so I got a new therapist. Everybody was like, this isn't working, we need a new therapist. And the new therapist basically said, listen, you need more help than this 1 hour a week. You need to go to a residential center because I think you need all around help. I don't think you can deal with all of this stuff going on at the same time. You need to put swimming and school aside. You can't go to college in the fall. At this time, I'd committed to swim for Harvard University and I was ready to go, 4 months after that fall. But she said, the therapist said, you need to take a break, go to residential treatment center, take a gap year and do this first so that you can actually succeed and be happy in college. So I conceded to that, even though I was very frightened and apprehensive about the idea, but I felt like I had no idea what else I could do. So I went to a treatment center. I went to a place called Oliver Pyatt Centers in Miami, Florida. They are a part of Montanito and Affiliates, which is the largest eating disorder treatment company in the country. They have 27 facilities worldwide, and I now consult for them on gender inclusive care, but we can get to that in a bit. Anyway, so I went to Oliver Pyatt Centers in Miami, Florida, and I spent 131 days there, which is about 5 months. And that was the first place I was able to really discover my gender identity. I realized that I was transgender, and I worked through so many other things as well and learned how to use my own sort of coping mechanisms that were more healthy. Cognitive behavioral therapy was a big help for me. DBT was a big help for me to really piece out what was going on in my system that made me want to use food and my body to control everything. Learning that I was trans was also a huge part of ameliorating the war I felt with my body, and the idea to transition also helped me with that. So that's sort of just the backbone of my experience. I wanted to start with that before I roll into my thoughts about gender inclusive care and sort of the effect that gender identity or struggles with gender identity can have on disordered eating, or the relationships between the two. So we're going to start off with sort of two definitions or categories. The first is body image issues, and the second one is gender dysphoria. They're very similar in lots of ways. They're sort of can go in and between each other. They can show up in the same person, but they're different categories distinctly. So the first is body image issues. That's a very general category and usually associated with folks who have eating disorders or disordered eating like anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, or binge eating disorder. Oftentimes this body image issues can also be linked to body dysmorphic disorder, but that's a different conversation, and we can get into that in another video. These things are distinctly different from gender dysphoria oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes. Gender dysphoria is the incongruence and the distress from the incongruence between one's gender identity or internal sense of one's gender and one's body, one's physicality. So for example, I was assigned female at birth. I was supposed to be this girl. I am not. I'm actually a man. I identify as male, but my body didn't always feel that way. It didn't feel like it matched how I identified. So I had breasts, for example, as a remnant of female puberty, and those felt intensely uncomfortable to me. They felt like they didn't belong. They felt like they weren't a part of me, and I felt dysphoric about my breasts. The key difference between these two things is essentially the treatment, and why it's important to talk about, especially when you're looking at occupational therapy or any kinds of mental or medical professional treatment. And the reason is gender dysphoria can be really treated by transition, by access to resources of medical transition like top surgery, hormone therapy, bottom surgery or genital reassignment surgery, gender confirmation surgery, as it is most respectfully called now. All of these things can actually really ameliorate that gender dysphoria. For example, I had breasts, like I said, I got top surgery. That was part of my medical transition, and that almost instantly cured my discomfort with my chest because it no longer had breasts, and I felt much more like myself, and it made my body feel safer to me. Body image issues, on the other hand, are often rooted in deep psychological schema or negative beliefs about oneself, usually pertaining to self-worth and control. And these aren't as easily cured by just changing one's body. So for example, and I'm going to talk from personal experience, I used to struggle a lot with body image issues. I was very afraid of getting fat and being fat and perceiving myself as fat. And if I had just gotten liposuction to take that away, that wouldn't have cured the self-worth issues that I was having or the lack of control feeling that I was experiencing. Those things would still have been there, and I probably would have just showed up in a different way, or maybe the same coping mechanism. There are a lot of people who lose all the weight they can until they're literally nothing, and that's why eating disorders are one of the most fatal mental illnesses. So my point is that one of these, gender dysphoria, has a pretty clear physical cure oftentimes, or treatment, which includes medical transition for many trans people. Not all trans people, many people have different experiences, but a lot. And body image issues are not in that way always. Body image issues don't have that kind of clear path with body. A lot of folks kind of throw in body dysmorphic disorder. Again, we're going to come back to that for just a second. That's an insecurity about, or an issue, or a preoccupation, or an obsession with a specific body part that is then seen incorrectly. And people confuse the words body dysmorphia and gender dysphoria. They're not the same thing. I think that people can kind of see confluence between the two, because you might get obsessive about a specific part and then call it body dysmorphia. But if it's related to gender, it's often referred to, and probably more correctly referred to, as gender dysphoria. Additionally, many folks with LGBTQ identities, specifically gender nonconforming and trans people, experience eating disorders and disordered eating at a higher rate than most other folks. And I think that's for a lot of reasons. And specifically for trans people, for people like myself, there's a lot of factors that result in a lack of control feeling for a trans person. So there's sociopolitical factors. I mean, there's plenty of systematic oppression against trans people in this country and in this world right now that make us feel like we don't have control over our lives. There are so many parents of trans kids that reject their identity as trans people, which can result in intense psychological damage. And if you can look at my video about trans kids below, you can see more about that and sort of the psychological issues that arise. But that creates a lack of control. And then lastly is this internal body-centric lack of control feeling. So for example, when I went through female puberty, I felt like my body was growing away from me and I had no control over that. And so I wanted so badly to have some control over something. And so a lot of trans people, specifically trans guys like myself, might turn to food to sort of ameliorate that battle with their body. And kind of controlling food can control that, or lend some sense of control to body size that then feeds into gender dysphoria, that kind of incongruence of body and identity. That isn't a healthy coping mechanism. Obviously, it's very maladaptive and very harmful, but oftentimes it's the only thing that we know how to do. And so treatment has to focus on allowing trans people to transition so that they can feel more at home and safe in their bodies, because taking testosterone was a very, very helpful thing, and getting top surgery to me having a better relationship with my body and with food, because I no longer felt like my body resembled a gender that I don't identify with. Another really important topic, I think, especially for mental health professionals, for trans people, is recognizing the difference between the body image issues and the gender dysphoria in a way that's validating. So for example, when I was in residential treatment, I actually had plenty of therapists tell me things like, oh, of course you're insecure about your breasts, you don't like your hips. Like, that's, plenty of girls are like that. That doesn't make you a boy. And I was like, no, it's really different. For me, it's really different, because this isn't about being insecure or having a lack of self-worth or negative self-talk about my breasts. It's about the fact that my breasts don't align with who I am. It is an identity issue, not a self-worth issue. And I think that's key to recognizing and validating, be able to say to your patient or your client, hey, of course you feel insecure about this because it doesn't match who you are. And let's work through ways that we can find you the resources to change that. Or if you don't want to get surgery, which is totally allowed, or you don't want to take hormones, again, totally allowed, let's work through how you can shift your perspective to accommodate your body being different from how you identify. So to close, like I said earlier, trans and gender nonconforming youth have the highest rate of eating disorders than any other demographic, for many of the reasons that I provided here today. And that's actually why I am now Montanito and Affiliates' first fellow, and I advise them on advancing gender inclusive and sexuality inclusive care, because recovery should be just as intersectional as our identities are. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope it was helpful. If you have more questions, feel free to email me or visit my website. I will put all the links up in just a second, and I hope you have a wonderful day.